on neurotransmitters. So what I'm showing on the screen now is the handout we've been using since we began this series. And what I'd like to do today is just kind of bring us back into the fold on where these things would overlay on the change grid. So obviously we've been talking about having some really great dialogues around it, but now I'd like to make sure we are bringing it back into where it would sit on the change grid. So I'll start by recapping what we've already learned so far. So here on the screen now, you should be looking at a change grid. We talked about the epinephrine and adrenaline neurotransmitter and what effect it has on placement on the change grid. And so epinephrine, adrenaline triggers the fight or flight response. So we had quite a big discussion around what is its relationship to tension management. And what we found out was that really it's directly connected to the perceived level of challenge. So the further up grid we plot, so the more stress we're experiencing, certainly that's obviously this feeling of greater levels of challenge. Fight or flight is actually being triggered at that point, and that would pull the epinephrine and adrenaline into action. So we said, okay, this feels right. And then I threw a question at you guys. And that question was, well, are we suggesting then that the adrenaline release is equal when you are at coordinates 0, 12, that would be very high level of challenge, but you see no ability to handle it, as it would be if you were also in a very challenging situation but thought your ability was a 12. And so, does your perceived level of ability impact the release of adrenaline? That's the question we have before us right now. So if you guys would like to unmute and chime in on that, what do you think? Is the adrenaline release the same? It's just how we handle that adrenaline release? Or is it that there's actually a different release based on our perceived level of ability in a threatening situation? Thoughts around that?
This is Kathy. Based on my total lack of knowledge, I'm going to state that that I can't imagine that the adrenaline level would be the same in both instances. I can't imagine, unless there is something else kicking in to counteract that adrenaline level that reflects perceived ability.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. Let me throw one thing out in the dialogue and see if this changes. You know, we talked about the fight or flight response. Do you think people in the upgrid danger zone are more likely to fight or flee? And in the outgrid danger zone, would they be more likely to fight or flee? Or are they going to find some other approach to a truly threatening situation? So Kathy, I'll throw that back to you.
Yeah, my 2 cents. At the top, at the upgrid danger zone, I think it's flee. And at the outgrid, I think it's fight. And that's just this is purely intuition. It's not based on anything else.
Well, yeah, but I mean, certainly.
What I know about the change grid, based on what I know about change grid behaviors. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, Jane is saying that she has connection issues. She doesn't see an option to unmute, so not sure if we can hear you. Jane, we can't hear you, but I'm getting your chats. I don't know if this is just a leftover Zoom challenge from the problems they were having yesterday, but yeah, I don't know. So glad you're here. If you'd like to chime something in, do feel free to do that. David said it happened to him as well, but it resolved eventually. So let's hope it does resolve, because yeah. Okay, so all right. So again, the fight or flight response. Now you guys know that in tension management principles, we talk about there being 4 ways that a life-threatening situation can be addressed or can be responded to. And we talk about there being 4 Fs, not fight or flight, but we also have freeze and fade. So sometimes you just freeze right in your spot, and that's the way you're handling this threat that's right in front of you. You just plain freeze. And then the other one is that you fade. You do your best to slightly blend into the background. Draw no notice to yourself. Be very quiet. And maybe, just maybe, it'll go away. So we talk about fight, flight, freeze, and fade. And those two others, freeze and fade, also occur at different danger zones. So, and we can certainly review that if you guys would like. Ellen, you can feel free to speak. Your hand's up. Go,
Sure.
go ahead.
Okay. You know, when we talk about this in conversational intelligence, we talk about fight, flight, freeze, or appease, which I think
Oh,
is a little different than fade.
well, absolutely. That means that if I've got a bear that's growling at me, I'm going to give it, well, obviously it's contextual,
Right.
but you're going to try to reason with it one way or another. Is that the thought?
Yeah,
So,
well, or just go along, right?
well, right. In fact,
I'm not talking about the bear, right? But if this is
no,
more
no.
interpersonal.
Sure. But you know what I'm reminded of when you bring that up are all the like little spy movies or you know, police dramas where the police or whoever has encountered the assailant. And I could just hear, who is the guy from Castle who's on The Rookie now? Patrick Fillion, I think is the actor's name. Um, I think that's the way he handles it. He's much better at reasoning with people, but often the person who is the targeted victim will acquiesce in that situation. And so is that fight? No. Is that flee? No. Am I fading? Not really. And am I freezing? Not really. Isn't that interesting that you've just introduced another way that you can do that? Jane, you are now visible and I've unmuted you. So
Okay, can you hear me now?
sure we can. Yep. Thanks.
Oh my God, I've had the worst morning with technical issues. I missed a whole class from 8 to 9.
Oh no.
So it seems like to me, and I've heard the freeze and appease too. It seems like to me that freeze and fade, or freeze is just a strategy to fade. Because if you think of an animal, you know, they freeze and they just kind of fade into the background.
Right. They become
So I
emotional.
would
They
think of
draw
those two
no
as the
attention.
same, but the appease is another strategy that you know, you try to act nice and bring the person over to your side.
And that's interesting because if what I've chosen to do is appease,
Mhm.
is that the response of someone who's in the upgrade danger zone? Or is that really a very calculated strategy, would be more of an outgrid sort of behavior?
I
So, you
I
know,
don't know how. I mean, those reactions seem to me to be not necessarily chosen. A lot of times they're unconscious, and I guess at some level they are chosen.
sure.
They're chosen unconsciously, but they seem to be more of an inherent characteristic of you know, of people, whether they're going to have that moving toward, moving against, moving
Hmm.
away, or moving with behaviors that are the
Yes,
fight, flight, move, or appease,
right.
or appease, or with freeze or appease.
Freeze, appease, fade, yeah, all those. Now,
Mhm.
one last thing I'll throw in, and then I'll let you guys kind of continue the discussion around this. But remember, everyone, that the change grid is not a flat two-dimensional diagram. We're showing it as such right now. But if we were to print this out on a piece of fabric and drape that piece of fabric on top of a ball in such a way that the PowerPoint, the purple spot in the middle, was at the North Pole, those 4 red circles end up becoming the exact same spot at the bottom. They
Mm.
all meet. And so while fight, flight, freeze, and fade seem to be very different ways of approaching a particular situation, the truth is they're all neighbors with one another. And I may jump in a micro millisecond between fighting and fleeing, or fighting and fading, or whatever the situation at hand requires or offers up as an opportunity, as the dynamics in that situation change. So I think there's that element as well. Now, appease, I would say to you that I like the concept of appease, but I wonder if appease is a survival technique? Or is it really something that comes out when someone actually believes they have a way maybe to navigate this situation inside of or outside of the fight or flight response? Or I don't know how to describe the relative positioning of it, but they're not quite there yet in feeling that this threat is so big. So thoughts about that? Oh, bless you.
Well, one is much more psychologically active than the other. And if you can't, let's say you can't flee or fade because you're there's no escape hatch, then there might be the appease. Okay, I get what you're saying. Let's, okay, yeah, I understand. And what you're trying to do is maybe bring down the intensity, but you're mostly saying, don't hurt me, I'm going along. So I think and that's a bit more passive than sort of the active negotiation around that.
Right, and so I think that who said acquiesce? I can kind of see that someone who's in the in-grid danger zone would just say, right now, and this would hold very true with the victim mindset, or the victim part of the drama, is that they're kind of going like, it's easier to just try to make myself as small as possible, fade as best I can. But if I'm noticed, what I have to do is be very cooperative, very non-threatening. I just have to survive another day. And so that concept of acquiescing, I kind of feel would resonate with that.
Yeah.
Where when we talk about someone who wants to, what was the other word you guys said? Fight.
Free.
Appease. Well, appeasing is over here still on the in-grid side of things. But that idea about maybe we try to negotiate it, maybe we try to reason. We used a word earlier that started with an I, but oh well, we can always record and see if we can.
Well, and I think one of the things is, appeasement or appeasement could be a conscious strategy to de-escalate a situation. And in which case, you could have your adrenaline, I mean, that could all be highly active, but you're able to downgrid yourself enough that you are making a choice to have a conscious strategy might be to de-escalate the situation and help,
And that's more of an analytic response.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, I'm just writing a few notes down here because I'd like to make sure we integrate this. So fight, flight, freeze, fade. We had appease, acquiesce, IECE. No.
SCE.
SCE.
Thank you. Acquiesce. Yeah, it's very, you guys all know this, that typing and speaking are different parts of the brain. So it's very difficult. I pity the person who stands at the whiteboard. So particularly if they're doing anything other than writing. Okay,
Pete?
yes.
I'm just thinking too, the appease and, acquiescing could be a learned behavior. Like domestic pets learn that, they've been conditioned to appease, and so I'm just wondering if it's instinctual or if it's more learned. But then I think of so many reptiles who fade and camouflage, which makes me think it's instinctual. So that's kind of an interesting.
Right. Well, yeah, because if we think about just the words, the freeze and fade behaviors, these tend to be more passive than active, where fight and flight involve high levels of movement. And I remember that I think it was Brian who kind of characterized that all neurotransmitters are about movement. Now, let me just go back to one thing, and then Denny's got an interesting contribution here I'd like to share with everyone. In fact, you guys should be seeing this in the chat. Oh, actually, I think the chat, yeah, you should all be able to see it. Okay, so When does adrenaline stop and noradrenaline come into play? So a concentration neurotransmitter, it is involved in the flight or fight response. It affects attention and responding actions in the brain. So is what's happening is that the adrenaline is subsiding a little bit or hasn't been triggered yet. So we are more in, I'll show the next one. This would be the noradrenaline. And let me just copy this. I don't know why I lost my little plotting. Yeah, but so this was something we kind of came up with in our dialogue was, well, we believe epinephrine, adrenaline, is going to be triggered when challenge is at its highest, but when challenge isn't quite so high, noradrenaline comes into play. And I remember Brian saying that that the chemical structure of the two neurochemicals is quite similar, and they're both competing for the same binding site on the neuron. And so the neuron's either going to accept one or the other, depending on who's giving up space for it to be there. So thoughts about that?
That makes sense. And what I wanted, this is Kathy, what I wanted to do is get back to that concept when I was saying that, you know, if you look at adrenaline, the adrenaline response, if you, it makes sense that the flee response would be upgrid, because your challenge is really high and your ability is low. So you perceive yourself unable to do anything but flee. Whereas, fight represents outgrid because you perceive your ability to fight back. I mean, unless you're put in a situation where you don't have any other option, you know, which happens as well. You might be boxed in, you have no other response but to fight.
Right, well, I'm in the water and the shark is right up against me. So you punch him in the nose, I guess. Is the only...
Yeah, but I think from a change grid perspective, that's how I would see it. That what you're saying is that noradrenaline noradrenaline would maybe produce that modification that we're talking about around reasoning,
yes.
You know, something.
Yeah, building a case, presenting a case, etc. Now, I don't know that the fill pattern should look the way that it looks, because unless we're going to say, yes, but the noradrenaline release that people experience when they perceive their ability as being low and the challenges being moderately high or ever increasing, but moderately high, would be a different response than we would find in the person who would be more on the down and out grid side of things. So that's a real fun one to think about, yes.
You know what, T? I think O.J. Simpson is a good example because he's a character that is so outgrid, but the one time in his life that he was fleeing in the white Bronco or whatever was the one time when his perceived challenge and ability. So I would totally agree, but I think he's a great example who generally lived his life outgrid because he thought he was invincible, but in the chase, I think it's a good example of what was said about where, you know what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah, I remember that. That's the world's slowest chase. Okay, pardon me. Okay, oh, Pam's joining us. Hi, Pam. Let me get going. Now, Denny shared there are a couple of other ways: face and fix or flow. Now, let's talk about where facing and fixing, flowing would reside on the change grid. So I'll go back up to a blank one just to have this dialogue. So I will throw out to start this conversation around the subject that those seem far more resourceful than the other ones we've talked about now. So face it and fix it, or flow with it, go along with it. That feels very different energetically than what a life or death fight or flight response would trigger. So thoughts about that? Where would those live? How does that dynamic come into play?
I think as you build resilience, then those become available choices when you perceive a really high challenge. So they would help you move down grid into the area where you feel more better resourced, more resilient, more capable. So I would see those moving down.
Yeah, and so different neurotransmitter living in a different place. In fact, if I remember correctly, the acetylcholine was the learning transmitter. GABA is the calming transmitter. So it may be a very different neurotransmitter. It's not so much about adrenaline, noradrenaline. It's about the person in that instant can, weigh things up as far as the challenge and their ability to meet that challenge, and that is going to immediately create some different sort of a thing. But I think it's going to be more of that GABA and acetylcholine that's going to come into play. So if we can set that aside for just a second, I'd like to show you the next two we did talk about, which were dopamine and serotonin. And then let's see if we can find out where GABA and acetylcholine would come into play to see if that helps plot Denny's way of coping with a situation in a more understandable kind of way. So dopamine. Now, dopamine is a pleasure neurotransmitter. Feelings of pleasure. It's also related to addiction, movement, and motivation. People repeat behaviors that lead to dopamine release. So thinking about that, where on the change grid would you say pleasure tends to live, this idea about being motivated, encouraged to do it again? Where does that feel like things would lie? So talk a little bit about the energies, if you will. Or what do you think?
Would that be 10-10?
10-10 would put me quite far out grid. So let's think about that. Does someone who would be a driven driver, would they find that situation as being, let's look at the words they gave us here, that it's pleasurable? I would say, yeah. Are there also addictions that occur as people become more driven driver types?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now, the kinds of addictions they're subject to is different energetically than the addictions that we find at other places on the change grid. So shall we review that quickly and see if that helps our understanding of what's going on? Yeah?
Yeah.
Yes or no? Are your available choices? Okay. So let's do it by way of quiz. Do you think that people who are very far out grid are more likely to become addicted to certain substances and certain behaviors, addictive behaviors, than other levels of energy? So we'll talk about that. Does the driver type favor certain addictive substances and processes? What's your thoughts?
Well, there's an intensity of goal seeking in that. And then there's also the adrenaline rush too that people talk about. I've had people talk to me about liking to being addicted to doing something last minute or doing something risky, and they'll talk about getting an adrenaline rush from it.
And wouldn't that resonate then to say, okay, see, that's the way that this adrenaline rush is being coped with by people that are out grid.
Yes.
And again, fight also means they attack something instead of fighting physically. They're attacking whatever it is that's in front of them, or they're, attacking whatever their argument is for whatever they're trying to put forth.
Or, I mean, that's how if you're a procrastinator and you think you have a very high ability and a lower sense of challenge, the way you can get yourself to finish stuff is by waiting till the last minute to do it. And then that increases your, challenge and can help you be motivated.
Well, exactly. In fact, everyone step in the confessional. How many of you have ever been guilty of writing your term paper the weekend before it was due? Burning the midnight oil and on and on. So I get that. Also, that would also be characteristic of the imposter phenomenon. Those of you who have studied the imposter phenomenon, although currently it seems to be being talked about a lot. I've seen coaches that work exclusively with the imposter phenomenon, and they act and present themselves as though it's something new. it goes back to the 1980s.
Yeah, no, that's been around for a long,
For a
long.
long time, but the person
I
who
mean, I
first,
work with it, but I don't present it as news.
yeah, it just wasn't marketed all that effectively back then. And
Well,
so
you know,
now,
There's also, I'm thinking of the defense industry that I've worked in, and this can be in construction in different places. What are the hero stories? And sometimes these cultures that are very much more action oriented, they get themselves in a mess because they haven't really thought something through. But then the person who's the hero is the one who pulls the fat out of the fire.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So,
It's always at the
so
end.
it's the analytic who always pulls the fat out of the fire by supporting the person who's taking the high risks. Is that the story you're talking about, Jane? Or?
It's someone who's got a certain. So if I think of it from ambassador perspective, there are the people who really think things through, and they're more analytical, and they want to know why. But then there are the implementers who, and what they're good at is getting into something that's not working on the ground, and they figure it out in the last minute.
Yes, yes, yes. So that's
And-
the driver. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that's a little bit more, and of course they have to be smart, right, at some level, or they're just really experienced, but they can go in and figure it out and direct people quickly, and all of a sudden the thing that looked impossible has just been solved. And so, you know, and the organization can become addicted to that because those are their hero stories. So I think it's interesting to think about what are the hero stories in a company.
Yes, absolutely.
And,
Yeah,
and
there has to be a bit of an analytical driver, though. I mean, doesn't
Well, you would think, yeah.
you know, I mean, I think that there's that element of analysis that's involved in it. But when I think of a hero, it's almost like a hero has a requirement, a prerequisite that the threat is great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's whoever takes that understanding and puts it into action.
Yeah.
Or does something declarative, definitive. So I kind of think that hero is the world of the healthy, driven driver.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But most of the driven driver area is more unhealthy than it is healthy. So let's go, you know, back to our discussion around addiction. But I like what you guys have just said. People get addicted to power. They get addicted to the rush that comes with succeeding in doing something, and that's going to pull them into that very, 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 very well. In fact, so I'm just going to go back to that particular diagram and say, okay, so I know it's happening here. Where else might it be happening? And so now we were talking about addictions. So the person who's in the outgrid side of things, the driver, is more likely to become addicted to certain types of alcohol, certain types of drugs, and certain types of behaviors than people who would be at the other extremes. So what do you think is the driven driver addict's alcohol of choice?
Cocaine.
That's their drug of choice. Absolutely. That's their drug of choice. Yeah. What's their alcohol of choice? Anybody?
Not beer.
Not beer. Not beer.
Bourbon.
Bourbon. It's got to be top shelf, fine quality. You know, they want the bourbon, they want the whiskey, they want the whatever was really expensive. Right? Yeah. So
Or it could be mezcal. It could be mezcal that, you know, has the worm in the bottle.
there you go. Something that has some risk involved in it. Or maybe it's very expensive wines. It's got to be something very top shelf because it's evidence of what does the driven driver really care about. So, you know, money can be made quietly. What does the driven driver really care about? Recognition, fame, winning in a visible sort of a way. So they like external displays of wealth. They like external trappings of success. So that's part of the dynamic that's going on with them as they do their thing. When it comes to drugs, you've already said cocaine. That always seems to be the one that people go to. I'll bet. And these days, though, there's some engineered drugs that they might also find themselves themselves attracted to. And when it comes to risky behaviors, these are the high stakes gamblers. These are the addicts that are more likely to become addicted to cheating on a spouse, because it's really about the thrill of the pursuit and the winning, the conquering, etc. So can you guys feel that addiction could be found out there, but the way the addiction is going to present itself might look and feel very different than other locations on the change grid?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now, if we talk about the person who's too far up grid, and again, if dopamine is related to addiction, this is going to affect how this overlays and how the fill pattern occurs and all that. But the people that are the expressive expressives, we'll talk about them. Not all expressive expressives, if such a personality type even exists, are addicts, but the expressive expressive way of expressing its addiction would be what? What kind of alcohol do you think expressive expressives like to drink? Anybody think about an expressive expressive? What kinds of things do they like to do? What kind of situations do they like to be in?
Well, I think that would be addicted to drama, creating and or being involved in.
Right, process wise, the people that are very far up grid tend to be very much involved in drama. In fact, you don't have to watch too many episodes of The Real Housewives of Pick a City, and you'll definitely see a lot of that dynamic going on. There's also a cattiness that might occur more down grid, but when those threats are all happening at an emotional level or as far as ranking in society, that sort of a thing, you might very much find some of that out. Now that's a behavior, an addictive behavior. We talk about alcohol. Think about the people that are upgrade. They love a good party.
What about
Wine, wine.
They'd have wine, sure. What else would they have?
martinis?
Martinis. They want fun drinks. They want it to have an umbrella in it, and so so they like all the fun concoctions, and if it's got steam or whatever that water vapor is when you put dry ice into something, they're all over that, and so they like to have a good old time. They
Fog
like,
cutters.
what's that again, Ellen?
Mai Tais and fog cutters.
Mai Tais and fog cutters, yeah, Long Island iced teas, but they want to have party drinks, something that's going to somehow or another support their expressive desires. Oh, by the way, when it comes to the real high-end clubs, the outgrid people are the bottle service people who buy the bottles for hundreds upon hundreds of dollars, and then everyone wants to come to their table, blah blah. So again, it's all about recognition, all about notoriety. Drugs of choice for people that are too far upgrid or energetically. What's the expressives drugs of choice? Okay. All right, these would be the club drugs, the party drugs, those sorts of things. So ecstasy, whatever else they've been engineering these days. I'm telling you my age, but yeah, none of it existed when I would have
You
been
know
in.
more about it than we do, T. So I don't.
Well, actually, we have someone who's certified in ChangeWorks who has their PhD in psychology, but their emphasis is in substance abuse, and their most interesting pursuit of the change grade is all about addictive processes. So I've had many discussion with him.
That's great.
Yeah, and so upgrade, and by the way, upgrades are also very likely to get involved in having an affair, but the upgrade energy is very attracted to the power of the outgrid individual, and the outgrid individual finds the upgrade people ready to party. And so they tend to work together. When it comes to gambling addictions, the upgrade person or the upgrade energy, instead of talking about them as a person, but the upgrade energy, likes lights and bells and whistles and all that sort of stuff. So these tend to be more of our, they want something social. So they're standing at the craps table. Who are they watching? They're watching the outgrid person who wants something high stakes going on. So can you guys feel these energetic distinctions that we might be able to make as we look at something that seems to be so one dimensional as addiction. Well,
Yeah,
yeah.
right.
So now the person on the Ingrid side of things, the amiable, they tend to also become addicted to different kinds of alcohol. What kind of alcohol do you think the amiable energy might be attracted to? Any thoughts on?
Margaritas.
Well, margaritas are more of a party drug. So these amiables are very quiet. They're very more into just wanting to have nice little conversations with people. You know,
Wine.
Wine.
they like having wine. What else do they like having? You'd have to live in an over 55 community to really appreciate this, but I live in one, so I can tell you. Okay.
Beer. I don't know.
No, beer's very downgrade. Beer's
Okay.
very
Okay.
downgrade. No, these are
Water.
the, what's that now?
Water.
Well, they like water. We're talking about what they get addicted to when it comes to
I
alcohol.
know. I'm teasing.
Yeah, okay, there.
And you go to a party here and you've got all the beautiful wine and you've got the liqueur sitting out and everybody goes, oh, I'll just have some water.
Yeah, exactly. But it's got to be in a nice glass. So they get addicted to the kinds of drinks that are socially acceptable after 5 o'clock. So they'll allow themselves to have a little martini. They'll have a highball. Who even, what generation today even knows what that means?
Right.
But
Right.
they allow themselves to have the socially acceptable drink after 5 o'clock. When it comes to drugs, they become addicted to legally prescribed medications. So it wouldn't occur to them to go and try to buy anything on the street or anything like that. No. They
Sleeping,
are, yeah, go ahead.
sleeping pills.
Sleeping pills, tranquilizers, and certainly anything that a doctor would prescribe to them, they immediately accept as being perfectly fine. They can have it. It can't really hurt them. After all, the doctor prescribed it to them.
Oxycontin.
Yeah, well, OxyContin, really, you think about that, we talk about things that are actively sought out versus passively sought out. And so a lot of people, in fact, I'd like to say the majority of people, and certainly in our experience, all of the people we know who have become addicted to Oxy had some sort of an injury. And they were prescribed it legally, and it became very problematic for them very, very quickly. So I think that's a particularly nasty one. Those whole opiate things, and different drama going on. But anyway, yeah. So that leaves us downgrid. Downgrid people would be more likely to go after the beer, more likely to go after the marijuana, because they're already downgrid. So anything that helps them be more mellow seems to be okay to fine for them. Process-wise, they have a tendency to become addicted to video games, addicted to TV. That's those sorts of things that are very passive, etc.
Would you think video games would be passive? I would think those are. Well, I'm not a I'm not a gamer, but
yeah, you got to choose your game. Choose your game
like
to figure out which one it would really be. I think that a lot of the video games that are very much about what do you call first-person shooters, those kinds of things. That's got to be all about this outgrid side of things as far as those games are concerned. But the people that are playing Candy Crush,
Oh.
this is more of a downgrade kind of a thing to do, or Okay, so I didn't want to take too much off that, but I wanted to say, if they're going to say that dopamine is triggered by addiction, well, is it only triggered by certain addictions? Or is it something that happens at all addictions? Because the addictions that are outgrid are different than the addictions that are upgrid and downgrid and ingrid. And I could also then say, if I do this, just bear with me for a second, I'm going to change that to a radial fill. I'm going to make it more pronounced as we move out grid, and less pronounced as we move to the center of the change grid. The place on the change grid you are least likely to become addicted is in the center. So because, you know, all kinds of other good things are happening there. But if that's the case, then this is what dopamine would be like. And so let's go back to the definition of dopamine and see pleasure transmitters. Do people who are downgrid, relatively speaking, as you move further and further downgrid, do you find that more and more pleasant? You're relaxed, you're comfortable, you're mellowing out. Could that be someone's definition of pleasure? Meanwhile, the person who's outgrid, who is more of a thrill seeker, and maybe, just maybe, it doesn't go all the way to these extremes. Maybe it just goes to, you know, it doesn't have to always map to the complete range of possibilities. But the person who's upgrid, pleasure is about having a party, being very social and interactive and lively and engaged and involved. That for them is pleasure. And for the people that are inside, the in-grid side of things, being with family and friends, having close, quiet interactions, that could be a real source of pleasure. So if that holds true, then this would meet the dopamine's connection to, sorry, just a second, dopamine's connection to addiction and to feelings of pleasure. But movement and motivation start to throw me off, because if I'm motivated purely to have those things of pleasure, okay, that would resonate. But if I'm motivated as in get things done, that favors outgrid more than the other three areas. Okay, thoughts about that? Discussion around that?
Well, that's
Yeah.
where you have cocaine and.
Yeah. Now, I have a specific comment about that because I was listening to, and I highly recommend this. I sent this to T. Dr. Andrew Huberman from, and Brian knows him, has worked with him, from Stanford, a neuroscientist who's done some really cool podcasts. He talks about the serotonin dopamine dichotomy, and he talks about dopamine more as, well, he talks about it as the pleasure, you know, transmitter. But he sees that, he describes it more in terms of, and I'm, so I know a little bit to be dangerous here. He describes it more in terms of what you want to trigger in the morning and through the day to actually get things done. So I don't know if he's talking about it in combination with the adrenaline piece, but he talks about the dopamine versus serotonin balance that we all need to maintain in order to have a healthy, productive life. And he talks about serotonin kicking in around 4 or 5 at night, which is about the pleasure piece that you describe as more of an in-grid kind of phenomenon.
Right, mood.
Mood and chill and all of that, and dopamine as being much more of the movement oriented, where pleasure comes from getting things done. And so I don't, you know, again, I know enough to be dangerous right now, but but it is very worth listening to that podcast. And you know, I sent that link to T if you want to distribute it, but it's so I don't know if you're talking about serotonin or dopamine there, T, when you're talking about in-grid.
Well, let's go up here because this would be serotonin. And if I superimposed dopamine on top of serotonin, that would seem to imply that as serotonin levels would increase, the dopamine level would decrease. And I don't know if that's the case. So that becomes the question, where does it fit?
Yeah, no, he kind of I mean, Huberman anyway seems to imply that they are two sides of the seesaw, you know.
Right, okay.
And so they aren't necessarily effectively combined in that way, but they need to be complemented. So I don't know where the connection point is, or where the overlap is, or how that plays out.
Right. Well, this is interesting because, you know, I'll make sure that Brian knows how to get on the call next for Thursday, and we'll see if he can help resolve this. But, you know, if we talk about serotonin for just a second, it contributes to well-being and happiness, helps the sleep cycle, the digestive system regulation, affected by exercise and light exposure. Let me tell you about serotonin because I have a very personal relationship with serotonin. So for my entire life, I have always existed at a certain base level of depression. And I didn't know until much later in life that there was a name for what I was experiencing, which was endogenous depression. So it's just part of how I'm wired, or how my neurochemicals are doing their kind of a thing. And so I remember long ago, there were these commercials that would talk about depression, and they would say, if you've ever had a period of more than 2 weeks when you were feeling, unhappy, despondent, troubled, blah, 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 you may be depressed. And my immediate response was, I've never had 2 weeks when I didn't feel like that. And so I ended up reaching out, and this happens to be one of the ways that Diane and I started really working together. And she said, "Oh, well, it's all about serotonin, and for whatever reason, your chemistry isn't hanging on to the serotonin. So let me suggest that you take something." And back in those days, we couldn't take that whole DNA related test to find out which sorts of medications would be best for us. So we tried a few things, and ultimately we arrived at what I call sertraline, is the generic name for it. But for me, it is, and I don't want to exaggerate in any way, shape, or form, it gave me my life back. It was absolutely transformative. And I have gone off of it a couple of times, and within a very short period of time, I'm way back to being very depressed, highly anxious, all sorts of things going on that I don't want to have part of my life, and all kinds of obsessive thinking and all this. The moment I go back on sertraline, it all simply vanishes because it's all in my head. And so when I think about where serotonin, when it's doing its thing, actually moves somebody, I think it moves you to the center of the change grid. It moves you to a place of balance and harmony and peace, where you really can have a mood that will ultimately support you in doing other things that need to be done. And I do find that stepping out grid, if I need to be out there to do whatever it is I need to be done, I find that to be rewarding, yeah, but draining. And I need to get back to my centered place. Or if something goes on that's very upgrid and pulling me out of that character, I go like, okay, whatever was need to be dealt with, I need to get back to my nice centered place. So between sertraline and yoga and a lot of the other things we all know about as PowerPoint maneuvers to move us to the center, that feels very right to me.
Yes, I
So,
agree.
you guys,
Yeah.
yeah, other thoughts around that? So this feels kind of good. Now, I would really believe that we are all experiencing a certain level of serotonin, no matter what. So I think it may very well stretch to all the edges of the change grid. But if we now go in from serotonin and say, well, maybe it's dopamine. Well, I can tell you that before I knew you know, an SSRI, something to help me get my serotonin back where it needed to be, I was always trying to cope in other ways of doing things. And so I've never been an addict or anything, because I come from a family of extreme addicts. And so because I watched that for so much, it was the thing I said, I don't care what else happens in life, I am never going to be one of these people. Um, and so I think that was really kind of my saving grace. But nevertheless, I would be someone who would pour myself completely and totally into my studies. So I was a student. I was a really, really good student, not because I particularly wanted to be, but because it was my escape. So even in high school, when you only had to go through to several periods a day out of a 12-period day, I would go there all 12 hours and volunteer or do study or independent studies or anything to not go home. And so I had my own way of coping with things that I do feel kind of like started to tip its toe into a little bit of an addictive sort of a behavior, but I was doing it to kind of self-medicate the what it wasn't misery. I mean, we weren't abused, but it was. I've always joked with people that If any of you would ever like to play a game of dysfunctional family, can you top this? I may not win, but I will be a finalist. So, you know, so that was my reality. So I share that with you just to say that I can relate between these more radial sorts of trend representations of dopamine and serotonin, but I honestly don't have the medical or scientific background to be able to say what you're looking at would be true. It just feels like it's my truth.
No, that makes sense. As you know, absolutely, that makes sense. Even based on what Huberman was saying. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
You know what, Key? Are we going to also talk about the natural highs and addictions that people have?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
As we move our way around on the change grid, we're
Yeah.
slowly working our way around this. I do hope you guys are finding this not only interesting, but actually useful. And my goal in doing these Circle of Brilliance calls is to, again, give you guys an opportunity to showcase what you got, so that as people listen to the recordings, hopefully someday that'll happen, you know, good things could come your way because of it. And certainly the primary task of the Circle of Brilliance is to perform these exercises in the merging of brilliance. So we'll be looking at a lot of other things and going like, how does this fit? How does this overlay? What difference would this make if we integrated it with the change grid? And I do find this overlay of these neurotransmitters to be absolutely fascinating, because it seems to support what we already know is happening at all these different locations on the change grid.
This is so rich for me. I mean, this is just brings things to a whole different level that I find just so helpful for myself and for people I'm coaching. I mean, things are clicking for me, falling into place.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, good. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Bye
you.
for now. Take care. Bye.
Okay.